Hello, everybody. Okay, and good evening to everyone. Look around you. A full house with such great anticipation. The excitement here in the assembly room is always exciting and electrifying when Todd is here because he charges us up with his tremendous presentations. I dreamt about this last night. Sometimes I feel like I'm a barker for the Buffalo Bill Wild West show, and any moment a horse with a lady bareback rider will come rushing through those doors, waving the American flag in one hand and a "We Love Todd DePastino" banner in the other. Our historian, author, and educator has dedicated his life to preserving and sharing the stories that shaped our world. His presentations are always incredibly lively, thoughtful, and filled with details that bring history to life. He is truly America's educator. Today, as we mark the 80th anniversary of World War II, Todd is challenging us to do something a little bit different, to a game of World War II trivia. Together we'll test our knowledge and discover fascinating stories that you may not have heard before. But before we do so, before you prepare yourselves for an afternoon of learning, laughter, and lively competition, I have a trivia question of my own. Think for a second. Don't shout it out. How many times do you think Todd has brought us such wonderful programs? Just think.
Many.
I've been here for 6 years. He's been here for 12, 10.
You're 22.
Okay, that's 22. Was he here all the time? All right. Anybody have any guesses?
A little bit less than 144.
That's right. That's good enough. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to our guide throughout history, Todd DePastino.
Thank you for that kind and eloquent introduction. I could only apologize for not delivering the program that was promised. I thought I would do a World War II trivia thing tonight. And then I started thinking, well, yesterday was Columbus Day. I should have a few remarks about Columbus. He's been on my mind. And I started jotting down remarks and looked over my notebook, and it came out to about half a lecture. So I thought I would add to that half a discussion of a mystery that I'm working on, which is who wrote the Pledge of Allegiance? And it's connected to Columbus Day. So the World War II trivia game will be next time in November. I'm very sorry about that. I feel badly for giving you the bait and switch, especially because what I'm going to talk about today is going to be a little bit complicated. And I'm going to be talking about Columbus Day, and then also the Pledge of Allegiance. So bear with me as I get into the details, especially with the Pledge of Allegiance, which I guarantee you won't be able to understand or follow. But it'll still be entertaining. Columbus Day was yesterday. This is the day that commemorates the landing of Christopher Columbus on San Salvador Island, Bahamas, on October 12th, 1492. About half the country actually commemorates or celebrates Columbus Day. The other half now officially commemorates or celebrates Indigenous Peoples Day. And, you know, I kind of think that that's actually should be how it is, because Columbus's landing on October 12th, 1492, was really the bringing together of two worlds which had been separated for 12,000 years. It's really, of all the consequential dates in human history, Columbus Day is one of the top three to five, one of the most important events to happen in human history. In 1492, there were about 400 million people in the world. 100 million of them lived in the Western Hemisphere. They had been entirely disconnected, no contact whatsoever, with very few exceptions, from Asia, Africa, and Europe. Columbus brought these two continents back together, and it would change the world, and would be catastrophic, of course, for the Native Americans. So Columbus Day is commemorated, celebrated. Columbus, of course, is denounced, and it's a little bit strange because Columbus Day functions mostly as an Italian-American Pride Day. And I was thinking about that when I got a phone call a few weeks ago asking if I could participate in the Columbus Day Parade. And I said, I can't actually, but I'm gonna be out of town. But I kind of wanted to say, like, very nice of you, great invitation. Are you asking me because I have an Italian last name? And she said yes, so that's my only connection to Columbus. The event itself, again, and this is a depiction that is in the Capitol Rotunda, is of Columbus landing in the Bahamas. This is the closest he would ever get to what would become the United States of America. It was the farthest north, the closest to Florida he ever got. He would make 4 trips between 1492 and 1504 from Spain to the New World, and he would go a lot of places, all down the Central American coast, all through the northern part of South America, all through the Caribbean basin. He would never step foot where the United States of America is. Here's a map of his routes. You can see right here is the furthest he ever got north. And it's what we're almost sure it was San Salvador Island that he landed on October 12, 1492, because it's a Bahamas island that is not very visited. There isn't much of a monument to it. This is it. Now Columbus himself believed, of course, that he had not come to the New World, but rather he had come to Asia. Columbus, in kind of conceiving this trip, and man, it took him a long time to sell it. And he was a great salesman, but man, it took him a long time to sell it because he believed in 2 unpopular things that turned out not to be true. He believed that the Earth was small and that there was no landmass between Europe and Asia. The conventional wisdom, every scholar in Europe, anybody who had ever read the Greeks or the ancient Romans believed, or anybody who ever studied lunar eclipses, which was a good way to gauge the size of the Earth, anybody who did any of that knew pretty much that the Earth was large and there was probably a very big landmass, probably a continent between Europe and Asia. Columbus did not believe that, and this is the hazard. This is the hazard of doing a last-minute lecture. It's not well formed in my mind, so I tend to make digressions. Here's a digression about Columbus, because I'm fascinated by the man. Just like I am fascinated by all geniuses who are self-educated, and that was Columbus. Columbus never went to school, and he was a genius, make no mistake. He was absolutely brilliant, but he was entirely self-educated. He was an autodidact. And what that means, I think because I'm so full of admiration for autodidacts, that I think I've missed some of the weaknesses of the self-educated. I myself, I am not self-educated. I've been ensconced in schools my whole life. And all my education came from schools with great teachers and mentors. And so I have a hard time imagining what is it like to learn without any teachers or mentors, to do it all yourself. I think one of the weaknesses that you have when you're an autodidact is you don't have the discipline impact of a teacher to kind of encourage skepticism and humility. So you tend to have great insights and you fall in love with your own ideas, and you don't have anybody there who's going to be able to warn you away or talk you out of it or give a strong counterpoint. You have the ideas and you fall in love with them. That was very much Columbus. He would not be thrown off his theory that the Earth was small and there was a landmass there. So this is a good map of what he believed. He believed that this was Japan and this was China. He believed that he had landed. He believed that Cuba was China, that Hispaniola was Japan. He thought that the Bahamas were like Taiwan, Formosa. And so this is how he conceived the Earth. You can see here in a faint background, here's South America, here's North America, Central America. This is how the Earth really is, but this in tan is what Columbus actually believed. So he believed he had landed in Japan. And he came back to Isabella's court, and I should tell you, it's stunning that he made it. Here and back. If you've ever seen a replica of the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, you'll know these are not ships, they are boats. They're tiny. He had 87 sailors, that's it, with him. It was not very well funded. I wouldn't cross the Mon in the Santa Maria, you know? And he comes to the New World, and by the way, Nina, Pinta, Maria, all prostitutes. They're named after prostitutes. So he brings back to the court of Ferdinand and Isabella some natives that he encountered. They're Caribs, they're the Tainin, they're Arawak Indians, they're Native Americans. And he says, hey, you know, I made it, you can see here, hey, you know, I made it to Asia. Here's this guy, he's Chinese. Here's this guy, he's Japanese. And here's this person, he's Indian. And then you have to picture, these are the scholars in the background. And they're saying, I don't think so. And they argue with him from day one, like, no, I don't know who that guy is, but he ain't Japanese, you know? Because they had read, like Columbus had, the journals of Marco Polo, they had understood what China was, and they knew that these people were from somewhere different. And it was probably that continent that they all assumed was there between Europe and Asia. One of these scholars here was a man named Peter Martyr. He was a scholar in the court of Ferdinand and Isabella. He was a very big proponent of Columbus. He wrote a lot celebrating Columbus's journeys. However, he would not say that Columbus had found a route to Asia. Instead, he said Columbus had found the Mondo Nova, the New World. So he was the first to name it the New World. Columbus, this was all for Columbus. It was all a money-making scheme, and here was the scheme. He struck a deal with Ferdinand and Isabella. He was convinced that there was a route you could take west to Asia directly from Europe, and he would find that route, return, and it would be his intellectual property, the route. It would be proprietary. He would sell it. He'd sell the maps to somebody who wanted to make the route. And then he also made this deal with Ferdinand and Isabella, and they came to really regret this, that part of the deal was he would own every island, every piece of land he stopped at, because these would be where you would get food and water to continue on the voyage. So he would just kind of, travelers would pay a fee to him. He was buying rest stops on a turnpike. That was the idea, and that was the money-making scheme. But when it turned out that Columbus ended up owning more land than Spain, that rule had to change. Peter Martyr is the one who called it the New World. One guy who picked up on Peter Martyr's reading and was obsessed with Columbus was an Italian merchant. He was a banker for the Medicis, Amerigo Vespucci. He was a Florentine, not Italian, he was a Florentine banker. He was obsessed with Columbus. He read about Columbus's journeys. He probably met with Columbus, and he considered himself Columbus's rival. We don't know quite exactly what motivated this guy, except we do have a record of him writing that he's obsessed with being famous in history. So he thought this would be a good way to be famous in history. Shortly after Columbus returned from the New World, Amerigo Vespucci got himself to Spain, volunteered to just be a passenger on an exploratory trip to the Indies. And so he went to the New World and came back and declared, this is a new world. This is not Asia. He kind of set himself up as Columbus's rival, that he had made the same journey as Columbus, but he had been smart enough to figure out this was a new world, This was not Asia. And Amerigo Vespucci was kind of a con man. He spun wild tales about his travels. He did make 2 trips to like Brazil, South America. He claimed to make 4, and almost certainly he did not. And then he told wild stories in his accounts of the 2 trips that he made. So he was because he was a banker and he was highly literate, he was successful in getting his story out, even more than Columbus was. So he became fairly well known, especially in the German-speaking world. And for some reason, the Germans were the best map makers at the time, the best cartographers. And I don't know why. There is a good journal article on why you would think that the best map makers in the 1500s would be from countries that actually made the journey west. Portugal, Spain, but it wasn't. It was Germans. The last time I looked, Germany was in the middle of Europe. Not quite landlocked, but almost. But they were making the maps that explorers would use. What made them so good? There have been a few articles on it. Some people have to say that it had to do with the complicated borders within Germany of these little kingdoms, that they became very good at kind of drawing maps from their surveys of the earth. This is a really important map for a couple reasons. It's one of the first projections on a flat piece of paper that can be applied to a globe. So it's like you're looking at a globe, but it's spread out flat. This was a projection by this map maker, Waldseemüller, and it's known as America's birth certificate, because this is the first time ever the word America appears in print, and it's right here. America. This German map maker, instead of calling it Columbia, decides to call it America after Amerigo Vespucci. And this becomes a tradition in Germany with map makers. So one of Waldseemüller's students, there's another image of it right there, America. Oh, and you'll notice it's not Amerigo, which is the Italian version of the name. It's not Americus, which is the Latin masculine version of the name. It's America, which is the feminine version of the name. Land is always named for the feminine. Always. Europa, Africa, Asia, India, China, always in it. America, always with an A. Mother Earth and Father in the Sky. That's how almost universally across cultures it's really remarkable that the earth is almost always associated with the feminine. Anyhow, one of Waldseemüller's students was Gerardus Mercator, the most famous Renaissance map maker who made the most accurate maps, the famous Mercator projection, which is kind of the first pretty accurate globe. Look how accurate this is for 1569, less than a century after Columbus made the trip. This is really striking to me, how they got it really well. And you'll see that Mercator follows in this German tradition of calling this America or New India. That's what this says, America or New India. America or New India, right there. So that's how America got its name, and that is, it's really this rivalry between Columbus and Amerigo Vespucci. Now, Columbus Day itself was never celebrated. This date, important as it was not a date of commemoration or celebration ever until 1792, 300 years later. And the first people to commemorate it were New Yorkers. New York was the first city to do it in 1792. And these New Yorkers were members of a special society called the Society of St. Tammany. Tammany Hall, that's where they met. It was also Tammany. He was a Delaware Indian chief. They were also called the Order of Columbus. So Columbus means something special to this group. And what Columbus means is a new America. These members of the Society of St. Tammany were all veterans of the American Revolution. They were all patriots. And they were dedicated to eradicating the British influence in North America. They pulled down statues, they changed names, King's College became Columbia University, named after Columbus. And Columbus is selected to represent this new world because he's not British. That's really his greatest virtue. Now, the problem with Columbus to the Society of St. Tammany, and also to his first biographer, this is the first biography ever written of Columbus. There had never been a biography before Washington Irving wrote one in 1828. And he tells very much the story that the Society of St. Tammany embraces. And that is the story not of an Italian. They don't call Columbus Italian, which is good, because Columbus would not have called himself Italian. And Italians didn't call him Italian. He is from Genoa. That was the important thing. He was from Genoa. That's not Italian. And to Washington Irving and to the founders, the fact that Columbus was from a Catholic country, that was problematic. And the fact that he wasn't English speaking, that was problematic. But Washington Irving portrayed Columbus as an Enlightenment figure. What Columbus was a scientist, more than anything. And it's Washington Irving who makes up the story that we all learned as children, right? That Columbus says, I'm going to head west and hit Asia. And everybody says, you can't do that. You'll fall off the edge of the earth because the earth is flat. That wasn't true. Nobody believed the earth was flat. Everybody knew it was a sphere. We knew because, again, of the lunar eclipses and many other things. But that's a story that Washington Irving makes up to promote the Enlightenment. Columbus is a figure of science, enlightenment, just like Benjamin Franklin, just like Thomas Edison, just like our founding fathers. He's a forerunner who's worthy of being, the progenitor of the new United States of America. So the 300th anniversary of Columbus's landing on San Salvador in 1792, that's the first Columbus Day. There's a celebration and a dinner in New York City. Then for the next 100 years, there's nothing until the 400th anniversary comes up. The 400th anniversary, by 1892, a few things had changed. Number one, the Italians, Italy, and I mean Italy, had embraced Columbus as one of their own. And that's because, for the first time in 1892, there was a country called Italy. There hadn't been one before. This statue in Genoa, which is like 150 feet high or more, is a statue of Columbus, Christopher Columbus' homeland, or fatherland. This is a statue of Columbus that was dedicated in 1862, the year after Italy became a country. Italy had been the most disorganized, still is, of the European countries. It had taken a long time for this thing to call Europe, this thing to call Italy, be put together. It was finally put together out of this mishmash of kingdoms. It was unified in 1861, and it was a very difficult unification. And so the Italians had to select a language for the nation, and they selected something that they called Italian, but was really, I believe, the Florentine language from Tuscany. And they had to create kind of these national heroes that everybody who lived on the peninsula could celebrate. And Columbus was one of those heroes. So Italy begins celebrating Columbus in the 1860s. And about 20 years after the Risorgimento, the reunification of it, or the unification of Italy, some of those Italians start traveling here. They come in big numbers. By 1890, they're coming, oh man, they're coming at least 100,000 a year to the United States. 4 million would come between 1890 and 1910, more than any other national group. These are the immigrants, the Italian immigrants. Here's a great kind of graph that shows you the spike in Italian immigration. It really begins in 1880, and then it falls off in 1920, but the peak of it really is between 1890 and 1910 or so. And these are people who are coming from the poorest regions, mostly the southern regions of Italy. They're flooding into this country. They came mostly to New York City, but the first place they went, even before New York City, the first place Italian immigrants went was New Orleans. And the first Italians to settle in New Orleans weren't, if you called them Italian today, they wouldn't be happy with you because they were from Sicily. There was one steamship a week, one per week in the 1880s, filled, every one of them, traveling directly from Palermo, Sicily to New Orleans, filled with poor immigrants who were being recruited to work on sugar plantations in Louisiana because slavery was over. They needed labor. They settled in enormous numbers in the French Quarter, which took the nickname Little Palermo. By 1890, there were 60,000 Sicilians living in Little Palermo, living in New Orleans, and it was like a preview of coming attractions. These were immigrants who utterly transformed the culture of New Orleans. Just like the Italians and all those other immigrants from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe would come in and transform the culture of the United States. They introduced food that nobody had seen before. They worshiped in churches nobody had seen before. They spoke languages that nobody had seen before. They did a number on what we know of as America. And by the way, New Orleans is one of my favorite cities, and if you go there, one of the best places to eat is the Central Grocery, and you can have one of its famous muffaletta sandwiches, and that's Sicilian. The French Quarter today has a lot of Sicilian influence that goes way back to these immigrants. I even have a friend, Paul Pellicelli, who claims, and he's made the argument to me, and I've seen him write a bit about it, not enough as he should, that jazz music should be credited in part to the Sicilians who came to New Orleans, who mixed with the African American musicians and Creole musicians and created this new music called jazz music. These immigrants also brought other traditions with them, like crime. And man, I mean, you could not open a newspaper in the 1880s, 1890s without finding some article about, crime out of control in New Orleans. And it was New Orleans where a new term was born, mafia. And you see them here. Here's Uncle Sam. He's welcoming these direct from the slums of Europe daily, these rats who are being dumped offshore, who are swimming on shore, and you could see they have mafia written on their hats, mafia with an Italian bandana there. This guy has a knife that says assassination. This guy has a pistol that says murder. They're bringing, crime. And crime did rise because the population in New Orleans rose, and these Sicilians were poor, and poverty usually breeds crime. And yes, New Orleans, definitely this is when New Orleans starts becoming violent and criminal in many ways. And then in October 1890, the chief of police, David Hennessy, Irish guy, gets murdered. Hennessy was you're related. You're David Hennessy. Have you heard of him?
Never.
Well, okay, then I could be honest about him. It turns out David Hennessy was as crooked as they get. He was mixed up, just like our own David Hennessy. He was involved in a feud between two Sicilian families controlling the waterfront of New Orleans. You know, like classic story. He gets whacked by one of the families, and it's used, this assassination is used as an excuse by the mayor, whose name was Shakespeare, any Shakespeares in the room, to round up Sicilian men. And they do, they round up 250 Sicilian men, cram them into jail, and after a few weeks select out about 19 of them to face charges in the assassination. I think 9 of them are originally brought to trial, others are being held without trial, but their other charges are going to be brought against them. And you know, there was a kind of a overwhelming sense that you know, that we got the guys. We got the guys who killed Hennessy. Italian thugs on trial in New Orleans for killing Chief of Police Hennessy. 9 members of the mafia sit in the prisoner's dock accused of a crime most foul. They are tried. The trial starts in February 1891. A month later, on March 14th, 1891, the jury comes out and finds them all not guilty. Turns out there was almost no evidence against them. So they were all released. Well, they weren't released. They were all found not guilty. There were other charges against some of them, so they were still being held at the jail. But you could see here, here's the none guilty. That day, after the jury came back with this not guilty verdict, a crowd assembled outside the jail, which is in the Treme neighborhood of New Orleans. Some speakers started speaking, riling up the crowd. The crowd got bigger, the crowd got armed, and by dusk, the crowd got violent. And they decided to break into the jail and lynch the Sicilian accused. They shot 9 of them dead in the jail and then dragged another 2 out and lynched them on lampposts. This lynching of 11 Sicilians in New Orleans in 1891 still remains the largest mass lynching event in American history. And at first, there was a lot of support for, you know, that these guys had done it, they were guilty, and the justice system had gone astray, gone awry, and the vigilantes were just kind of, you know, settling the score. Chief Hennessy avenged 11 of his Italian assassins lynched by a mob, an uprising of indignant citizens in New Orleans, the prison doors forced, and the Italian murderers shot down. And then there were some protests started to emerge. First from Italy, which was now a country and had relations with the United States. We know, we have this wonderful quote from the diary of Theodore Roosevelt, who was in the US, he was a commissioner in the US Civil Service Commission in Washington, DC. So he circulated among diplomats and he wrote this: various Dago diplomats were present, all much wrought up by the lynching of the Italians in New Orleans. Personally, I think it's a rather good thing and said so. But the Italians didn't think it was a good thing and they recalled their diplomats. This became a little diplomatic kerfuffle. The Italians were outraged. They already had grievances for how Italians were being treated in America. Anyhow, the parliament, the Italian parliament, took a vote, a resolution, a toothless resolution, saying that, you know, we should consider sending the Navy to American shores to intimidate the Americans. And, you know, the country of Italy helped to kind of promote this as a cause célèbre in the Italian American community in America. And it wasn't just Italian Americans, it was also Irish Americans and other groups of recent immigrants and Catholic immigrants who really seized on the lynching of these Sicilians as an example of the kind of injustice and discrimination that the new immigrants were facing. So you have this kind of a headline in a pro-ethnic newspaper: demons loose in New Orleans, a wild mob numbered by the thousands, avenge the murder of Chief Hennessy, the wretched Sicilian band butchered, cut down by a rain of lead while they crouched like hunted animals in their prison yard. So this becomes a major issue in American culture in 1891, in the fall of 1891. And 1892 was an election year. So inevitably, this issue gets brought up in the election. The election features the sitting president, Benjamin Harrison, a Republican from Indiana, against the challenger, Grover Cleveland, a Democrat from New York. These two men had run against each other before, 4 years earlier. Back then, in 1888, Cleveland had been the sitting president, and Harrison was the challenger. Harrison won barely. He won in the Electoral College. He lost the popular vote. And he lost the popular vote mainly in the cities. It was the turnout in the cities that went to Cleveland. It was the current turnout in the rural areas that went to Harrison. So Harrison was very sensitive to any issue that might encourage high turnout of immigrants in cities. So he wanted to diffuse the issue of the Sicilian lynching. So he contacted, through diplomatic channels, Italy, and he made a deal. Very quickly, over probably 2 weeks of negotiation. The first part of the deal was that the US would pay reparations to the families of all 11 Sicilians who were lynched. $25,000 each. A lot of money. A lot of money. Number two, the US would accept as a gift this statue of Columbus, because the Italians were now proud of Columbus and they wanted to give a statue that would represent their countrymen in the New World. The US would accept it, would pay for a base for it to be put in a prominent location in New York City, and Harrison himself would dedicate the statue on the 400th anniversary of Columbus's landing in the New World. He would in fact declare October 12th, 1892, the day of, what does it say? Day of Discovery, that would celebrate Columbus. And that helped, that certainly did diffuse the issue with Italy. And that's how kind of the first public, nationwide Columbus Day was born, from this kind of political settlement. The statue would be erected. It's still there at Columbus Circle. And Harrison would proclaim Columbus Day in July of 1892. He would make the announcement that it would be a public holiday. And I'll read some of these words, and I highlighted a few of them in yellow because I want to talk about them. I, Benjamin Harrison, President of the United States of America, do hereby appoint Friday, October 21st. We'll get to that. As Columbus Day. On that day, let the people cease from toil and devote themselves to such exercises as best to honor the discoverer of this country. Columbus stood in his age as the pioneer of progress and enlightenment. So again, he's a symbol of progress and enlightenment. And the system of universal education is, in our age, the most prominent and salutary feature of the spirit of enlightenment. So it's appropriate that schools be made by the people the center of the day's demonstration. So this Columbus Day would be celebrated on October 21st. It would celebrate Columbus as a figure of progress and enlightenment, and it would be focused mainly on the schools. That was the idea. Let me say a few words about October 21st, because I have been told by members of my family and every friend I've ever had, and everybody I've ever encountered, that I'm an overthinker. You know, I think too much about stuff. I'm not spontaneous. I have to study something before I, make a decision about it. I'm going to tell you history's worst case of overthinking. And here it is. Somebody like me in 1892 was advising the president and said, we can't have the celebration on October 12th. 1892. Because when Columbus sailed, he sailed under the Julian calendar. And we live under the Gregorian calendar. And that was true. The Julian calendar had prevailed in the British colonies until the year 1752. And in 1752, Britain and the American colonies decided to change to the Gregorian calendar. And they did it overnight, on one night, in September 1752. In September 1752, people went to bed on September 2nd, and they woke up on September 14th. So this is a month in history that only had 19 days. So the person made the argument, you know, we have to do it 11 days ahead of October 12th if we want to really be historically accurate. So here's October 12th, 1892. 11 days ahead of that is October 23rd. But October 23rd is a Sunday. And this is going to focus on schools. So let's move it to the closest Friday, October 21st. That, my friends, is the worst case of overthinking I've ever heard. So this celebration was done on October 21st, 1892. And the publication that decided to leap into this effort to kind of celebrate Columbus Day, the 400th anniversary of Columbus landing in the New World, was the most popular magazine in the country at the time. It's called the Youth's Companion. It's actually a wonderful magazine. If you were a good writer, you had to be actually a great writer. Jack London was published in it, Mark Twain, Emily Dickinson. I mean, this was really a high quality magazine. It had the largest circulation of any magazine in the country. It had the highest ad rates. It had been around since 1827, the Youth's Companion. The Youth's Companion decided to leap in to this celebration or commemoration of Columbus Day, this day of discovery, and they created this national program that every public school was supposed to follow to commemorate Columbus Day. Here's the program in all its detail. It was published on September 8th, 1892, that edition of the Youth's Companion. September 8th, 1892. And part of the program was a flag raising, and part of the flag raising was this new thing called a pledge of allegiance. And here is how it appeared in the Youth's Companion. This is the first time the Pledge of Allegiance was written. I pledge allegiance to my flag and the republic for which it stands, one nation indivisible with liberty and justice for all. That was it. And there gives a description of how the salute was supposed to go. The kids were supposed to salute the flag, and this is what it was supposed to look like. And so Columbus Day did come, and there were some of these commemorations around the country in schools. We know that because we do have plenty of archival copies of programs that were followed in schools around the country. It wasn't universal by any means, but it was rather common thing to do on October 21st, 1892. The media covered it, and then everybody forgot about it. Nobody ever celebrated Columbus Day again. Nobody ever did a flag raising again. And nobody ever did a Pledge of Allegiance again. The pledge would be completely forgotten until after World War I, when a new veterans organization called the American Legion decided to promote patriotism among the youth and among American citizens. And in 1923, the American Legion, with the Daughters of the American Revolution, got together and held a flag conference. This is how to treat the American flag. There had been no rules governing the flag, the American flag. You had crazy flags of different dimensions. You had stars all shoved in one corner. I mean, literally. You had some flags with more stripes than there should be, 15 stripes. There was no real code for how flags should be respected or handled. And this flag code that was created in this, and then updated in subsequent years, that was created in Washington, D.C. in 1923 is the flag code we use today. This is how the flag should be flown. This is how it should be, appear on a casket. This is how it should be folded. It's probably 100 pages of a flag code describing every possible use and misuse of the flag. And among the code is a Pledge of Allegiance that the American Legion and Daughters of the American Revolution pulled out, and they reached back to that old publication, the Youth's Companion, from September 8th, 1892, and they reproduced it for their own flag code with one modification.
Under God.
No, Under God would come in 1954. That's a really important addition. What they changed was this. The first pledge was, I pledge allegiance to my flag. This says, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. That's because they didn't want little Italian kids thinking in their hearts that they were pledging allegiance to their Italian flag. So I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. This was published, and it became a thing. It did take off. The American Legion was dedicated to getting school children to recite this every morning. And they were really successful. It was very much a well-organized, well-disciplined effort to kind of get a flag in every school and get kids to recite this every morning. And as the pledge was taking off, one man stepped forward and said, I wrote that pledge. And that was this man, Francis Bellamy. And I know this because I used to teach this. I used to teach about the 1920s and the rise of patriotism and the flag. I used to teach about Francis Bellamy because he has an interesting background. He was a Baptist minister from Boston who took a job with the Youth's Companion in 1890 as an editor. And he said in 1923, years later, when we were putting that program together for 1892, I'm the one who wrote the pledge. And he told the story of how he wrote it. He actually testified in Congress. He wanted to be officially recognized as the author of the Pledge of Allegiance. And he told a long story. He was sworn in. This is under oath. He had other people testify on his behalf that, yes, I was there in August of 1892. August of 1892, the Youth's Companion would come out September 8th, 1892, and he said, I was down on a warm evening in August 1892 in my office in Boston that I shut myself in my room alone to formulate the actual pledge. Beginning with the new word allegiance, I first decided that pledge was a better school word than vow or swear, and that the first person singular should be used, and that my flag was preferable to the flag. When those first words, I pledge allegiance to my flag, looked up from me from the scratch paper, the start appeared promising. And then he went on and describes how he chose republic instead of nation and country. And it goes on and on and on of how he, really wrote a masterpiece alone in Boston in August 1892. It turns out this story, which I used to teach, is not true. He made it up. He's a Baptist minister. He made it up. Do you know how he really got the pledge? Because if you do, tell me. We only know that he didn't write it. He plagiarized it from someone. And the only reason we know that he plagiarized it from someone is that this man found it earlier, before August 1892. Now listen. In addition to being accused of being an overthinker, I've also been accused, and I just spent the weekend with my 2 children, I've also been accused of being a nerd.
No.
If I'm a nerd, I don't know if there's a word for what this guy is. He is an etymologist. He studies word origins. And he'll study things like, I think he spent 7 years researching why is New York nicknamed the Big Apple? Because there was no clear explanation of where that came from. He studied it and found the answer. So Barry Popick, just 2 years ago, doing his own, researching something else, was reading through the Ellis County, Kansas, that's wrong, not Nebraska, the Ellis County, Kansas New Republican, the issue from May 21st, 1892, and he sees an article describing a flag raising at a school on April 30th, 1892, 2.5 months before August, when Francis Bellamy said he wrote it. And he sees in this article that the kids hold their hand at arm's length toward the flag, and they say, "I pledge allegiance to my flag and the republic for which it stands, one nation inseparable, with liberty and justice for all." Wow, is that remarkable? That's exactly the words that appeared in the Youth's Companion, with, except for one difference, inseparable rather than indivisible. How could Francis Bellamy have written it in August when this was said in Kansas in April? The answer was he couldn't have. Francis Bellamy had to have plagiarized this. This is the mystery I'm working on. And the answer lies, I think, where did this come from? The answer, I think, lies in this folklore that Kansas has. Anybody here from Kansas? Excuse me?
I was born there.
You were born there. You're one of the 50 people who were born in Kansas. Kansas has been arguing since the 1890s that the Pledge of Allegiance was born in Kansas. I mean, there have been articles about it. There's an old article, I think from 1914, about how the Pledge of Allegiance came from Kansas. There's every 20 years or so, the Kansas Senate passes a resolution. We hereby declare that the Pledge of Allegiance was born in Kansas. There's a monument somewhere in a cemetery in Kansas saying, you know, this is near where the Pledge of Allegiance was written. And the story goes that this is the Kansas folklore that I had heard about but was long disproven. It was disproven by the Library of Congress. It was disproven by scholars. This is the folklore. The folklore is that the Youth's Companion had an essay writing contest in January 1890, so 2 years before the first Columbus Day. And the essay writing contest was write a 600-word essay, kids, on the patriotic influence of the American flag. This woman, whose name is Lillian Hendricks, she was a patriotic instructor with the equivalent of the American Legion. And she traveled, this is in 1892, so it wasn't the American Legion, it was the Grand Army of the Republic, Civil War Veterans Organization. She was in the Women's Auxiliary or the Women's Relief Corps. She traveled from school to school in Kansas trying to promote Americanism and patriotism in schools. And she went to this little elementary school in Cherryvale, Kansas, and she challenged the students, write an essay. I will review all the essays. I'll send the best one to the Youth's Companion. And if we win, the school will get a flag and you'll get a year subscription to the Youth's Companion. So she collected all the essays, read them, and she was struck. Oh, I gotta set this up better. She was struck by an essay written by one 13-year-old boy. In the essay, she said, was a pledge of allegiance. She was wowed by it. She submitted it to the Youth's Companion. The name of the boy, the 13-year-old boy, was, get this, Frank Bellamy. You'll remember the guy who claimed to have written it was Francis Bellamy. This is a different person, Frank E. Bellamy. He's 13 years old. He writes it, it gets submitted, he never hears back. Then, 2 years later, he's now 15 years old, he sees his own words in the Youth's Companion on September 8th, 1892. And he writes the Youth's Companion and says, great, you know, you've selected my pledge. Can you give me a little credit? And he gets a letter back from the Youth's Companion that says, all property submitted to the Youth's Companion is property of the youth companion. So, didn't get an answer. He forgets about it, but Lillian Hendricks never does. She continues to travel on her own. This is a one-woman campaign to get the schools of Kansas to say Frank E. Bellamy's pledge in school. And it looks like she succeeded in the 1890s. 1898 would come. It would be the Spanish-American War. Frank E. Bellamy would now be 21 years old. He would join the army. He'd be sent to the Philippines. He would survive, but he came back a broken man with tuberculosis. And he would die not too long after. The story of Frank E. Bellamy and Lillian Hendricks would go down as folklore. And it was investigated by several people, including this very good scholar. And I'm not saying this, I would not say this to disparage this scholar, Richard J. Ellis, because I taught the same thing. I read his book, and I taught the same thing. This is a good book on the history of the Pledge of Allegiance. To the Flag, The Unlikely History of the Pledge of Allegiance. He says that the Kansas high school student passed off the Pledge of Allegiance as his own work, and it was not until several decades later that the fraud was recognized. And it says, you know, he duped Lillian Hendricks, but it turns out he didn't dupe her. The person who duped us was Francis Bellamy. Here's what had to have happened, and I can't prove it, but I have a half a mind to try. I think that Francis Bellamy received the essay. He read it. He remembered it. When he was writing his pledge, he went back to it, found it in his record somehow, copied it down. Maybe the plagiarism was made easier because they had the same name. Maybe. And passed it off as his own. So I think the Pledge of Allegiance, we have to thank Frank E. Bellamy. Francis Bellamy no longer gets credit. All right.
They look like the same guy.
They look like the same guy.
Yeah.
So this conspiracy goes deeper than we know.
They related?
They're not related. Apparently they're not related. And so we know almost nothing about Frank Bellamy, almost nothing about him. And the only thing, even Barry Popick didn't really follow up on it. He just tweeted, hey, look at this. I found the Pledge of Allegiance from April 1892. And that, triggered interest. Frank E. Bellamy, that's the folklore from Kansas has to be true. All right. So next time, I will be here next month. I still don't know what date, but this time, I promise, I will do World War II trivia. I'll see you then.